Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, Eric. Can you hear me okay? I'll take that as a yes. If there's any problems with audio or video, please let me know. It looks like the chat's open, so I'll just be monitoring that. Of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat as well, and I'll try to keep an eye on those and address those here as we go. Certainly, at the end of the presentation, we'll have time. I'm happy to stick around as long as anybody has anything that they'd like to discuss. As Eric mentioned, just a brief introduction. The only thing that is not on that bio is I just recently retired from the Air National Guard out of Des Moines, Iowa. I was with the Sioux Falls unit for about 15 years before transferring down there. Last few years I was in the Guard. I did cyber protection, cyber defense. So kind of a broad background in cybersecurity with the DoD, with academia, with private sector. And so that's where all of my perspectives and experience come from. I still do a fair bit of consulting work, high-level assessments, guidance and sort of counseling to hands-on technical things like penetration tests and incident response. So if that can be of any assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll post some contact information in as well, and I certainly maintain a healthy social media presence. With the Guard retirement, you'll have to bear with me. I'm in that obligatory period of not shaving or not cutting my hair. My retirement just went through in December. I was part-time, and so I'm kind of in the thick of it and not really sure what to do. So it's been interesting having to take a brush with me when I go places. That's not something I've ever had to deal with before. Today's kind of a topic, the agenda is to talk about cyber. I could talk about this for days on end. I have courses that talk about this for days on end. And so I just want to cover a variety of sort of high level issues that everyone is dealing with, organizations are dealing with, especially, those of you that are working with, sensitive, privileged information, such as your clients. To talk about some of that high level and then look at also some of the technical details, some of the underpinnings there. So that's my goal, and just to help raise awareness and do it in a way that hopefully is entertaining and engaging. To kind of set the stage, then, the first thing we'll look at are what I would consider common attack scenarios. Unfortunately, we still have the email as a main source of attacking organizations, attacking users. And with those emails, it can be, instructions in the emails, it can be links in emails. It oftentimes is an attachment through an Office document, like a .doc or a .xlsx, so a spreadsheet or a Word document. Those are still very popular, still very prevalent. As long as there's a need for organizations to have Office documents, they're probably going to be weaponized and abused. It's been a problem for years, and I don't see anything here in the foreseeable future changing that. So we always want to be very wary when it comes to dealing with emails, and in particular emails that are directing us to do things. There are other problems with emails, and we'll get to those in a minute. How these work, though, or how they're oftentimes what we would consider weaponized, is that those emails are attached. If they can get in front of the user will open them. Typically, if there's some social engineering, this is where it's going to be at its most prominent, because not only does the email have to entice the user, that potential victim, to open the email and open the attachment, but then the attachment, the Office document, also has to look convincing enough for them to enable this content. And then typically this involves enabling macros. There are other ways that Office documents are used, but by and far, macros are the most prevalent, the most common. This makes them hard to just block out outright, because again, most organizations have a need for Office documents with macros to be used, and so they can't just block all macro enabled documents in their environment. It is possible. If you don't need macro enabled documents, you can block them. I would suggest doing so. But since this is such a core feature to the Office suite, then that's what makes it challenging. So probably not going anywhere, but those macros, the macros run the execute code, and that's what the attackers are after. They want to get that code to execute in order to gain a foothold into the environment, onto that system, and then from there reach out to command and control, download additional tools, explore the environment, determine if there is something that is of more interest to go after, database servers, data, dropping ransomware, what have you. The attacks typically work in stages, right? The email's sent, the Office document attached to it. If it's opened and those macros are executed, then it's likely going to reach out to get additional stages of the malware, or at least attempt to. It can do that getting a little bit more technical through things like PowerShell and JavaScript. These are things that are just built-in capabilities within Windows. And the focus typically is on Microsoft Windows because that's the most popular and prevalent operating system out there for corporate America, for the enterprise to work off of. It reaches out to the internet to download the next stage. So oftentimes the malicious document doesn't contain the actual malware, right? It may be a malicious document, but if it cannot reach out to the internet and download that next stage, then in a way you've had an unsuccessful attack. It's successful in the fact that it got in front of the user and they enabled content. So there's a lot of kind of fail scenarios there. How did it get to the user? Why did they enable the content and open it? But if it can't download the next stage, then you don't necessarily have malware in the environment. So it can be a good thing in some ways. But again, operating in phases and stages, and that's just something to keep in mind as we go through our discussion today. If the malware does get in the environment, then we move into what I consider a post-infection. That's, again, where you might see lateral movement, you might see ransomware, you might see that the threat actor just lays dormant for a while and observes the environment, tries to steal information. Maybe they're implanting backdoors. It all depends on where they land and how robust your environment is. So that's sort of a general flow. This is, again, very common attack scenario, certainly not the only one, but keep this in mind as we go through some of the remaining topics. What is a malicious Office document? Well, kind of discussed that already. They're Office documents. This can include PowerPoint, pretty much anything in the Office suite that has macro ability. I even think like publisher files and others have that ability. So you've just got to be very, very apprehensive, very leery about anything that's coming into the organization, certainly if it's unsolicited or not expected. Those macros then can be executed. Very common to use macros, but not the only way. Something that you'll find with Microsoft, if you're not real familiar with it, I mean, certainly everybody uses it or has used it, but Microsoft is they're very good and bad, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it, in keeping technology around forever. So we've had this resurgence in this issue with Excel documents, and there's a feature in Excel that was introduced back in the late 90s. It's still in there in Excel, and it's resurfaced as it's been abused in order to distribute malware. Much like in the way that we're talking, it's just instead of using macros in the sense that they are kind of the standard way by today's standard, it's an old technique, and so it was bypassing security tools. It was bypassing a lot of things because we just the security industry wasn't focused on detecting that sort of technique. So Microsoft has a lot of backwards compatibility, so we've got to be kind of careful with that. Documents that contain M extensions, you can't always trust the extension, and that's something that I do hear from time to time with a lot of folks that maybe aren't as familiar with computers in general. Is that extension, it's completely arbitrary. The only thing a file extension does is it helps the operating system understand what should open that file for you, but that doesn't mean that it can't still be opened or executed. So sometimes these documents will come with very strange extensions, and it's still the operating system oftentimes will have the ability to open those and understand those and execute that code, which is unfortunate. But because they're built for users, they do a lot of things to try to make things easier. And so we're constantly wrestling with this. How do we make things more secure without making them more difficult to use? We don't need to get into the analysis. The social engineering, this is typically where you'll see the most. And you think about that attack layout that we just talked about. As we move from left to right, we get away from wanting to, they get away from wanting to let the user know that they're there. So it's common to see inside of the email, a relatively reasonable sounding email, although a lot of times you'll be able to pick up on grammatical mistakes. You'll be able to look at where the email came from. If it came from a Gmail account, that's a pretty big indications that something's not quite right. When you open that document, then you'll see images like this. And again, a lot of the more prevalent threat actors out there, they take the time to create very convincing looking images. They abuse brand logos. As you can see here, all of these abused the Microsoft brand using the actual icons from Excel and from Word. They give instructions to tell the user what to do. That's, of course, the big part with the social engineering, is telling them what to do, because once they get them to enable macros, then now it's all behind the scenes stuff. It's all happening on the system over the network. And unless you have something in place to monitor that, you as a user no longer have any visibility. You hear IU stories all the time. Somebody got a malicious Office document. They opened it up. They clicked enable content. They get a message like this: hey, if you really want to see this doc, you got to enable content, and then it'll show up. They do that. Nothing happens. They close it. Maybe they open it again. Nothing happens. They close it. Maybe they send it to a friend. They open it. Nothing happens. Well, lots of stuff is happening. It's just they can't see that. They can't see that because, of course, enabling the content isn't going to all of a sudden give you a legitimate looking document, because there's nothing there to actually reveal to you. So it's important to be able to monitor for those things, and to be able to observe from whoever is providing your security the visibility to say, hey, your organization's under attack. You may have had an incident. You may have had a breach, because again, not every breach is going to lead to immediate ransomware drop. You might have folks that are going to stay in the network, stay quiet. They're going to observe. They're going to steal credentials. They're going to do other activities. We'll talk about business email compromise in a minute, and they might do something like that. So we talk about that. That's sort of an active way that the adversary will try to elicit responses. It's phishing, right? And that's why it's taken that name. They blast these emails out, and they hope to catch a few people that'll engage in those documents. There are any number of ways. I'm trying to focus on some of the more common, some of the more prevalent, but there are a number of ways that organizations are under attack, essentially. Another one that is very damaging is just what you expose to the internet. There's certainly been a rush over the last couple of years to get folks to be able and productive to work from home. That is, for a lot of organizations, that's exposing access to resources that maybe were only on premise at one time. But now that you've got remote employees, allowing them to remote in to get access to email, to a database server, to a file server. And a lot of times that rush to get things out, it's not done properly. And so things can now be exposed to the public internet in ways that can cause great damage to the organization. There's a utility out there. It's called Showdown. If you're not familiar with it, I suspect many of you are not. What it does is it's like a search engine, but instead of indexing content, it indexes systems and then what services are running on those systems. So is there a database server? Is there a web server? Is there an email server? Some things are supposed to be public, right? Web servers are supposed to be public because we want to provide access to the greater world. A lot of things are not supposed to be public, though. And so this engine, the search engine, it goes through and it scans the internet, looking at these hosts and finding things that are exposed. So a lot of penetration testers, security folks that come to your organization and say, okay, we're gonna try to give you an assessment of how secure your environment is. If they're looking at the external exposures, this is a tool that they use. They will also, of course, do scanning themselves. That's going to give them real-time results. Showdown's going to have a little bit of a lag, and you can't really control how it scans. The important thing with Showdown, though, is that there's a separation. Like, I'm not going to scan your environment unless you give me a contract or a kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card that says I have permission to scan your systems. Showdown does that for us. So all we're doing is looking at Showdown's data. So I'm not doing any scanning myself. So all the results you see here are provided a la Showdown. If you had engaged me to do a penetration test, then I would get a written contract and agreement that you gave me permission to do these scanning against your computers. Now, people are out there scanning all the time, right? Every day, all day long. It's something that is just so incredibly common. It would be hard to go after anyone. But still, as a security professional, we certainly teach all of our students that unless you have permission, you could get in trouble. You could get in legal trouble. So here we look at computers have ports. Ports are just like a door on a computer system. There's up to 65,534 ports. So each port provides an ability for a computer to listen external to itself, like a web server. Port 3389 is remote desktop. And just searching all of Showdown's data, and they scan the globe, there was 4,000 or just over 4.8 million hosts that exposed RDP publicly over the internet. That was 2020. In 2021, I should have probably updated these for 22, but it doesn't, numbers haven't changed too much. You can see there was just a slight uptick, 4.8. What's the problem with having this service exposed? Well, it's remote desktop. It's that ability, if you've ever done it, to launch remote desktop session from your computer and log in remotely and basically have a desktop session. That's terribly insecure and should not be exposed over the public internet. There are better ways to do that, such as forcing employees to connect over a VPN so that they have a secure tunnel back to your organization, back to the network proper, and then establishing a remote desktop service. So these exposed services like this can lead to vulnerabilities. Attackers can go out, they can scan, they can say, oh, hey, look, we found someone who has open RDP and we know how to abuse that. And now they might be able to get access to your system. Just because it's out there doesn't mean it can be exploited, but it's a greater likelihood. And so it's a risk that you have to be aware of and figure out ways to eliminate and or mitigate. This is, I just actually did a little bit of poking around here before the presentation, looked up a few law firms in the Sioux Falls area. Somebody has a site hosted. I removed who it was. And on the server, this is all the ports that are open. And they've got some really bad stuff exposed to the internet here. That's probably because it's a third party. They're hosting the site for you. So you don't think much about it, but this is some really bad stuff to have exposed. And this only took a few minutes of just real casual searching in order to find this. What could it lead to? Well, I mean, it could lead to a compromise of the server. It could lead to any data that is on those systems being removed. It could lead to code injection. So they could put in some code that anytime somebody went to that website, it maybe did a coin miner, or it tried to download malware, or it redirected them to a popular one is, for whatever reason, sending them to like pornographic websites. So lots of bad things could happen. And something to keep in mind, because I hear this pretty regularly, is, well, I don't worry about security for X, Y, or Z because I have a third party that worries about it. So here's a good example. Well, your third party is doing a pretty poor job. So you do need to be responsible. And I would argue if they're your customers and it's your data and it's your reputation, it's still on you to figure out if this site has my personal data that I'm entrusting you to store, and they get popped and my data gets leaked. I'm still coming to you to say, what's going on here. So I think it's on the onus of all organizations to protect their data and their customers and their reputation and their brand, no matter where the information or who they're contracting in order to provide services for them. Don't assume everybody understands cybersecurity, because there's still a lot of folks out there that are maybe very, very adept in IT and software development, but they don't have a clue really when it comes to security. It's really diverged in terms of the fields. A lot of folks think, well, like me, I get this all the time. What do you do? I do cybersecurity. Oh, can you come help me fix my printer? I don't do IT. I despise IT stuff. I don't despise it, but I just don't do that kind of thing, because they're very, very different skill sets. Even with mature IT team that are very, very good at what they do, that doesn't mean that they're also going to be equally good in security. It's again a very different mindset, a very different skill set, and it's only continuing to diverge here over the years. Business email compromise. So this is another very important subject because it can really be difficult to detect. The gist of this is that somebody gets into your email account, and then they're actually able to send email either on, well, they're able to send email on your behalf, or what's more likely the case, they're going to wait until there is a conversation and then they're going to jump into it. So a common one would be wiring instructions. You're sending an email with wiring instructions. Probably not a good idea anyway, because email is just not a good medium to transfer sensitive information. But it happens regular enough. So if you are sending something sensitive like that, well, if an attacker is in there watching your email, they can intercept the communication, or they can respond before maybe the actual employee does, send bad wiring instructions to the potential or the intended victim, and give them bad wiring directions. So now the money gets wired somewhere else, they get a payday, and they get out. It's harder to detect, because if they're actually in the email account, then it's coming from that organization, it's coming from that person. And if they've already established rapport with them and they've already established communication, it's just really hard to detect. So probably the first thing is don't do stuff like that that's very sensitive over email. Email is not secure. Never has been. I argue it never will be. There are other ways to secure email. And again, we could talk about that at length, but at least wanted to get it out there on everybody's mind. Again, there are certainly better ways. Hard to detect. Here's an example, again, going back to Showdown. So, it's email is it's very common to expose remote email capabilities so that you can log in via a portal like Outlook Web Express or Outlook. Yeah, I think it's Outlook Web Express. I just forgot OWA. So if we go to Showdown, we do a look for web pages that in their title have Outlook, and I grabbed an IP rock that was one from SDN. So SDN is a South Dakota network. They're a big internet service provider here in the region. They own a lot of IP space for the region. IPs are assigned to our devices so that they can communicate over a network. So if we can look up, again, all this information is super easy to find. It's publicly available. Look up an SDN and say, okay, yes, let's see how many IP ranges SDN owns. Grab one at random and look for anybody that has an exposed OWA portal in this environment. And here you can see these are real results. Again, very easy to find this information publicly. And I'm guessing a lot of these names you'll probably recognize. So there is Outlook Web Access portals on all of these servers. And that's just generally a bad idea, because oftentimes that leads to vulnerabilities that can be exploited to gain access to the server. There are other issues. Adversaries can try to guess usernames and passwords. They can brute force these portals to try to gain access to someone's email account. Certainly is possible. It's not always feasible, depending on username conventions and how complex passwords have to be. But it's definitely something that every penetration test that I've been a part of, that's always a part of it, right? Let's go out there, let's scrape for open source, let's try to figure out as much as we can about your organization. And then if we can find things like this, well, let's try to brute force, because we might get lucky. And oftentimes you do. It's pretty easy. I have an example in just a minute. It's pretty easy to generate usernames. It's also fairly easy to guess a lot of people's passwords. For example, it's spring. Well, I'm saying it's spring. It's maybe a fake spring, but it's spring enough. So spring 2022, spring 2022 exclamation, spring 2022 with a capital S and an exclamation. If that's anybody's password, you should probably figure out how to do something that's a little more complex, because typically there's two parts to getting access to a system. There's the username and the password. And the password should be the harder one to guess, but a lot of folks, because they have to change them regular, they develop patterns like the seasons, like the year. Maybe it's a mascot for the company or the company name. I teach at Dakota State. The mascot's a Trojan, so Trojan 2022. There's oftentimes someone that has that password. And so if I were to go brute force, I could preload my guesses with usernames that I think are valid and passwords such as that, and that would increase the odds that I'd be able to get into the system. This also touches on multi-factor, and multi-factor is that it can be kind of annoying, but once you've authenticated, then you have to provide an additional, oftentimes it's a 6-digit PIN, 6-digit number. Maybe you have an app on your phone that you have to swipe just to acknowledge. And what that's doing is it's saying, hey, this person, in order to finish logging into the system, they have to go to this device, typically your phone, that they have physical possession of, grab a code or acknowledge some sort of a notification, and that'll finish the process. And the idea is that then if an adversary gets your username and password, they're trying to log into the system, because they don't have your multi-factor, they can't log in. So I would encourage everyone to go and enable multi-factor on everything that you can. It is a bit of a pain, because then you have to open up your phone every time. At least do it on things that are sensitive, because it is effective. You'll hear defense in depth as a concept or a topic with cybersecurity, and of course with other types of security, but particularly cybersecurity. And it's one of those, sort of defense in depth. Well, if we have to expose we really shouldn't, but we're going to. Let's force multi-factor so that at least we have some additional hurdles that somebody would have to go through in order to compromise an account fully. Username and password breaches are also pretty common. So having, my LinkedIn password, because Facebook's been really bad at it. I don't use Facebook, but they've had a lot of breaches where all of their customer data gets dumped and then it gets released to the world. Well, if you're using a password on Facebook, well, now as a bad guy, I could go and harvest that data and then use that against you to try to maybe gain access to your corporation, to your organization. So that password reuse is also something that's a bit tricky, because passwords are annoying. I look for the day when we no longer have them, but they are necessary at this point. And so trying to have unique passwords for everything you do is something to strive for. There are password managers that do make that easier. If you haven't looked into one or aren't using one, I definitely encourage that. What else do you post? So, thinking about just the open source, every penetration test, again, that I've been a part of starts with open source information gathering, or OSINT. Here's a tool, just a brief snippet of it. It uses all of the popular search engines out there, and it looks for documents, PDFs and PowerPoints and anything from the Office suite, just using a search engine. So again, it's a kind of a passive form, because the search engines already index all of the content that they find online. So I don't have to go and do any harvesting from your sources directly. I can use a search engine. Once it finds it, ooh, that's a fail. But you get the idea. It goes ahead and it downloads all of that content. So here you can see this was from DSU. So we've got a bunch of PDFs and a bunch of PowerPoint and stuff. Oh no, well, that's not any good. Well, what I was going to show you here, and I would stop the presentation and fix it, but I'm afraid my desktop will go crazy. What you'll see there is that there's another tool then, once those documents are downloaded, that it will look at all of the kind of the metadata, look for author, look for created by, and harvest all of that information. And so you'd see, if you could see that bottom image, what you'd see is a bunch of usernames and actual employee names. So you can kind of see mine at the very bottom there, because that's oftentimes the information that is saved as those documents are being created. So it's something to keep in mind. If you can find that kind of information and download it and harvest it, even if I just have like Stroshine Joshua, well, I'll show you in a moment, you could probably come up with my actual username based off of just knowing my name. So harvesting that information just makes it easier when you're trying to solve that username password problem to try to brute force things. So we always just want to be very careful as to what we're putting out there and what information it contains, overtly through the content of the document, and then sort of unintentionally through the metadata that it saves inside, as we're using the tools to create those documents and such. So here's a good example. DSU, I like to pick on my employer. They've got a directory on the website, dsu.edu. You can go there, you can see everybody that works there, all faculty, all staff, everything's posted. If you if you look at the page, and we're going to talk about how to do this in just a second. If you go to the page in a browser, you view the code behind it, the source code behind it. It's very simple, very easy to do. You'll find that in that listing is everybody's information. And if you'll notice on the bottom of this current screenshot, there's a link to email. So you can click on that, and then that will open up a window using your default mail client, and it'll populate the to line, which means that the email address is actually in this content. So what that means is that we could scrape all of that information from that site. As you can see here, this is an example of doing that. We have a very large directory, and then from that information, because the username format here happens to be first.last at dsu.edu, we can pull that information off. We can do that through scripts. So again, it can be completely automated, and then we can just create permutations of that. So as you can see on that lower right screenshot, the first is just extraction. That could be my username. Well, then if we do the first letter of my first name and the last name, J Stroshine. What if we do Stroshine, just my last name? What if we do Stroshine.Joshua? So we just arrange the order. What if we do Stroshine J? What if we do the first letter of my first name and the last 7 of my last, if there's only 7 or greater? I can guarantee you that those are my usernames for all the critical systems that DSU offers me, because that's the method that they use. So now I've just scraped not only everybody's email address, but I've been able to come up with a greater likelihood that I actually have valid usernames. So if we couple that with the ability that I bet somebody at this university has the password of winter 2022, spring 2022, Trojan 2022, yeah, I got a pretty good chance I'm going to get in if there aren't other things to block my access, such as multi-factor. Do you speak cyber? So talking about viewing source, see stories like this all the time. Missouri vows to prosecute a hacker who informed state about data leak. It's understanding the terminology, understanding the space is very important, because a lot of folks, that just like any profession, if it's not something you do on a regular basis, it's very easy to not understand really any of the technology. So this particular case here, you can read about it. I think it was a journalist who viewed the source of a web page, found in the source some encoded information, decoded it. Encoding and encryption are not the same thing. So encoding is typically much easier to break, and to me implies no sense of privacy. Encryption implies there is a sense or an expectation of privacy. So they decoded some data. They found things like social security numbers and other sensitive for, I think, residents of that county or that state. They informed the governor, and now they're dealing with potential legal action. So in this case, the journalist or whoever wants to report this is trying to do, I think, the state a service by saying, look, you've got an issue, you need to fix it. Did they cross a line? I don't think so. Anybody, when we talk about content in a browser, it gets sent to you, it's all there. Your browser just renders it in a way that's more visually appealing, but all the source code is there in your browser. So there is zero expectation, or there should be zero expectation of privacy in that code. Other ways to handle that. And now this governor, whoever it is that's wanting to prosecute this hacker, is, to me, demonstrating just a complete misunderstanding or just incompetence in what cybersecurity really is, or those who are advising them. So this makes it so that people don't want to report these things. A lot of big companies will have bug bounty programs. They'll say, hey, look, if you find bugs, we're going to kind of give you blanket permission to test our systems, and this is how you can report them. And guess what? If you find something really juicy, we might even pay you for it. Not every organization needs that, but this person didn't do anything active. It's not like they went and used some special hacker tool to get access to the part of this application or this website or a database server that they shouldn't have. All they did was view the source of the page. So they even didn't really do anything that I would consider offensive or criminal or anything. But a lot of this is still open to interpretation, and it's my understanding that the laws around cybercrime are still so super vague that pretty much anything can get prosecuted for any reason, such as this. How easy is it? Well, this screenshot just shows if you go to a page, you could open up your browser right now if you have never done this, right click, and you'll get the little pop-up menu, and you'll probably have an option here to view page source. If you do that, there's all the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript. So all the things that make the page look and behave the way that it does when you're viewing it in your browser. So if anything sensitive is in that content, that's just, again, generally considered a bad thing. If it's data just for you, okay, I mean, it's kind of how the web has to work. But if you can view data for other people in the system, and you shouldn't, to include having other folks' social security numbers or seeing their credit card numbers or being able to view their addresses, then that's a problem. So this is what that story. So again, it's very important to understand just how the technology works, and talking to someone who knows how the technology works. And I would take this a step further too. Kind of to piggyback on something I said earlier. You may be working with with a company, a service provider, or have a team that's helping with security. But if that's not really their forte, I would encourage to find someone to be a cybersecurity representative, someone that you know and trust, that can provide at least on a big picture guidance to help you identify risks, to identify exposures, and to help mitigate that. All right, what about cyber war? It's kind of hard to ignore what's going on in Russia, Ukraine. Certainly there's a lot that could be talked about here. My point, though, is just to focus a little bit on the cyber aspect of it. Cyber war is a thing. We have cyber weapons. We have cyber capabilities. They can be kinetic. They can facilitate kinetic. They can do all sorts of stuff now. So it is definitely a big part of all of our nation states, and they're military and their homeland defense kind of capabilities. What we're seeing with things like this conflict in Ukraine is that a lot of folks are deciding that they feel like they need to do something, so they're getting involved, even though they may have nothing to do with an army or a military or either one of these countries proper, and they're doing so because, or they're doing it in a way through cyber, because, hey, you know what, I can, sitting here in Brandon, South Dakota, I could go after assets in Russia. I can go after their cyber infrastructure, and I have potentially an impact. So it's possible. Super duper illegal, right? If I don't have permission, I shouldn't do it. And what are the odds, though, that I'm going to get caught? Probably pretty minimal, right? Because I know how to cover my tracks. And with all the stuff that's going on over the internet, how would I ever get identified unless I did something really bad, like blew up a centrifuge or something? Well, this is so we're seeing a lot of people doing this. Groups like Anonymous are just taking it upon themselves to go ahead and decide to kind of launch these cyber warfare to be a part of this conflict. And it's interesting from that cybersecurity perspective, but something that this can happen any day. That what we're talking about, the attack of cyber infrastructure, the techniques and the tools that they're using, the effects that it can have, this stuff happens every day, and it can happen every day. Just because it's being directed in a war doesn't mean that it's not also being directed at our critical infrastructure, at our organizations, at our intellectual property. So it's making news. Certainly, if you're watching what's going on, you might hear stories about cyber from time to time. But this is just how it is with cyber, right? It can happen, and it does happen all day long. If you really get into cybersecurity, you'll eventually come across this matrix. It's called the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. And what this does is it lays out all of the different ways in which organizations can be attacked, with the idea that then you can take this and help to better defend. I don't expect everyone to be able to read this. I just wanted to show you that, yeah, it is really there's this much stuff going on. It is complicated. It is overwhelming. Even experienced defenders have a hard time 100% defending an environment, because there's just so much there. And the greater that the organization grows, the more IT infrastructure they have, the more data that they possess, the more difficult it is to protect that. Facebook was an example, right? They've had, again, several breaches over the years where they've lost all of their data, right? And Facebook was one of the top, technology companies out there, arguably. I wouldn't say they were, but they are. They definitely make a lot of money. So they have the budget to hire the top people in the industry to come and work as their security team, and even they are not able to secure all of Facebook's assets. So it's just difficult. I don't think it's impossible, but it's very difficult. So we're just really talking about initial access, because that's the point where you're going to experience it the most common, right? Trying to gain access to your infrastructure. And then once access is gained, everything gets a lot stealthier. Everything's harder to see unless they decide to drop ransomware. Then you're going to know about it. But there's a lot that has to be done in the environment. Again, I farm it out to an MSP or an MSSP, a managed services provider, a managed security services provider. Well, do you know for sure what they're doing to ensure the integrity of your data? You got to have those discussions with them and be comfortable and confident that they are in fact doing so. MSPs can be another way in. It's another scenario. If, let's say, I'm a criminal and I want to attack a bunch of people, well, if I can compromise an MSP, well, then I can use that MSP to pivot into maybe 15, 20, 30 different organizations, rather than having to go after them one at a time. So, if an MSP, it's kind of like putting all your passwords in a password manager. Well, if that thing gets compromised, all your passwords are gone. MSP is kind of the same way. I'm not saying not to use them, but there are certainly risks associated with that as well. What are we dealing with? Here you can see these are some URLs, hopefully nothing inappropriate in that. A lot of infrastructure that is out there to help facilitate attacks against organizations is compromised infrastructure. It's somebody else's infrastructure. So most of these are all sites known to have been distributing malware at some point here in the recent past. Most of these, well, the TLDs probably the top level domains, some .net, some .com.ng, .co.uk. Well, that's the UK. That one's a little more prevalent. .ac.id. I mean, they're not popular, but they're all probably legitimate websites that somebody set up to do something for their business, for their club or organization or activity. These get compromised and then they get used to distribute malware. So it makes it harder to detect, because if it's a legitimate site, then and it's being used to deliver malware, how do we discriminate? How do we differentiate between that? So you'll see tools like browsers will try to block it. You may go to a site from time to time, and Chrome will pop up a window that says, you shouldn't go there. This has got some sketchy stuff. But it's really hard for those lists to be accurate, because this changes so quickly. There's so many websites out there that are compromised all the time. If you manage your infrastructure, right? If you have a website, I'm guessing everybody does. You need to be aware that people want to compromise your infrastructure. We talked about it a little bit earlier, and they want to do that in order to host malware, to deliver content, to do any number of things. So you got to make sure that those are being managed and maintained and kept up to date, and think through too, what happens if it is compromised. I've just talked to a colleague yesterday. He was working on an incident where somebody's website got compromised, and having a hard time figuring out where the attack came from. How did they get in? How do you then effectively know that you've not only gotten rid of them, but you've shut the door so that they don't come back? And a lot of that is just because there's not proper logging. There's not basic hardening of the server it's running on, basic hardening of the application that it's running on. And it just causes issues. So customers were showing up, they were getting redirected to a porn site or something. I don't remember what was exactly going on there. I don't think he or she mentioned it. It wouldn't be my position to share anyway. I'm probably not going to get through all my slides, but this is the most important stuff was at the beginning. Keep in mind too where your code comes from. A lot of, again, if you're not a developer, you're probably not thinking about this much, but there are any application that we look at, whether it's a desktop application or a web-based application, there is likely dozens of projects that go into it. And so we have this thing I built for you. Maybe it's your client portal, but then I use 17 other projects in order to help me build that. Well, how do I know that those projects that I used didn't already have a backdoor? How do you know that the code that I used didn't already have a backdoor or some vulnerability? I've done some research with HP. We were looking into finding, where are a lot of these websites that we were finding that were distributing malware. How were they compromised? And it led to this screenshot you see here. This is called GitHub. It's a website, github.com. It's owned by Microsoft at this point. It's a place for people to share code. So it's very popular to get, to develop code, to develop a project and put it out there, and then others can use it, oftentimes under a license that's free of charge. So it's very common for a lot of our software to come from popular projects on GitHub. Well, if somebody makes a copy of it and then they backdoor it, and you go to copy that project, not realizing that you didn't get the official one, well, now you've just introduced backdoor code into your environment. And so it does happen. Ensuring the integrity of software is actually quite difficult. And so it's just another one of those many things to be aware of, especially if this code is collecting private, customer information, social security numbers, and the like. What happens if an email gets through? You get something like this. Usually you get the enable content, which is that little button there. Don't do it, but if you do, that's when the macros are enabled. And again, users, for the most part, nothing's going to happen other than this ribbon's going to go away, and now all of the bad stuff's going to happen in the background. So if you don't have something to monitor it, something on the host, something on the network, then you're kind of at the mercy of what happens next, and at the bad guys, I suppose, discretion. A lot of clever ways to abuse Office documents. We could spend a day on just that alone, not just macro, but other ways to include this content and execute it. Like in Office, the Office suite is a very powerful suite, and with that though comes a lot of ways to abuse. Typically, I would say that if you get a pop-up that says something, enable content, update content, don't click it. So if you made the mistake of opening the document in the first place, Okay, sometimes they're really hard to tell whether it's coming from a legitimate or an illegitimate source. But if it's asking for any sort of input, I need to do something, I need to update, I need to retrieve content, don't do it. Report it if you can. If you can't, delete it. Maybe others in the organization receive the same thing. Oftentimes these things come out in campaigns, so let others know. Don't forget about phishing. These are also very, very, very convincing. I find these all over the place. It's because we talked about browsers, all of that code comes back to us. So if we go to the Microsoft online login portal, we have all the code to make it look like that. We can't necessarily make it behave because the authentication happens on their server, on the Microsoft server. But if all I'm trying to do is take your username and password, I can create a website that looks just like the real deal. It collects your username and your password, sends it to me, and then redirects you to the legitimate site. Maybe pops up a message that said, hey, you failed to log in properly, try again. Now you log in properly and you don't think anything of it. These are, these can be links inside of a document. They can just simply be a link in the email. So a little bit easier to get through oftentimes an organization's perimeter because there's not an attachment, there's just a link in the email. And because emails support HTML, we can hide the link. So this site, or at least one of these, this is actually where it was hosted on, art by lalia.ro, right? If we're authenticating with Microsoft, we would never, ever do that over a site like this. And so if they can hide that link, again, most users might not know to inspect it or to hover over it. They go here, they try to authenticate, it fails. Their credentials are gone now. They get redirected, they log in. Now they're none the wiser. But the adversary has collected those credentials. So looking at, again, being careful with clicking links. If you click the link and went here, does anything bad happen? Not necessarily, not unless you put in your username and password, but it's just better not to click the link in the first place. If you end up there, again, make sure it makes sense. Where do you log in? Look at the URL, you look at the URL bar. Is this the normal place where you log in? This one not only is a strange host, but the lock with the line through it, it's not even a secure session. That means that the communication between your computer and that server is not secure, which you're already on a bad site, so probably doesn't matter so much. But definitely if you were expecting to be on office.com and you get that broken lock image, well, something's not right. And I would stop and not proceed. So phishing is also very prevalent. They get your username and password. Conversation that we just had applies, right? Now they can find maybe an OA portal. They can log in as you don't have multi-factor on. Now they're in your email. They can do a lot more damage. Okay, this just gets into some of the nitty gritty here. Again, starting on the left, you open a doc, you enable content. Nothing happened. I'm not getting this shipping invoice that I'm expecting. On the right-hand side, processes are firing, network activities firing, and you have to be able to monitor that in order to successfully prevent. Tracking images, that's just something that I've done with HP. They are another indicator to help, but they're just something that you have to rely on a security team to help with. They're definitely, most of these look pretty convincing, but there are oftentimes you'll see grammatical errors. English as a first language is not a lot of where these folks operate out of, so you'll see grammatical things. But if you're dependent upon a grammatical mistake in this image to detect a phishing attempt or an actual malicious attack, then you're hanging on by a thread. Okay, yeah, we got just a few more minutes here. I'm happy to share the slides. Again, this is just sort of the in the weeds stuff. Looking at some of the Excel documents, they're just, it's more of the same. It's just the way in which they're abused changes. And so unless you're really getting into a position where you're digging into these and trying to unravel them, you'll never see it. Sometimes the social engineering is a lot more convincing. Here was one that was CyberArc was a cybersecurity company. It didn't do anything until you tried to unlock the file. Then once you click that button, but then all the bad activity sort of unraveled. It gave you a prompt as it was for a password file, and then it always says that you've got the password wrong. So the idea there is that it looks more legitimate when it's really not. It just was prompting the user and trying to be a little bit more stealthy, which can help overall with the malware living longer out there in the wild. That reached out to a host, 3x.ag. Again, really shady looking stuff, but if you don't have somebody monitoring your network, you'll never see it. Everything comes in stages. It's just another way of getting payloads in, monitoring on the network. Don't forget that there are more than just Office docs. There are more than just sending directions or links inside of an email. There can be zips that you opened up the zip and then you double click the thing inside the zip and it's actually a script. This was an example of a Visual Basic script. The effect is the same though. It's going to try to download content from the internet. Once that next stage comes in, then that's likely the malware. That's where things persist and you really have a problem. So all attachment types, you have to be very suspicious of unless you're expecting them from a user. This is just more, there's just more anti-analysis. This is something, again, less to deal with the social engineering side, but things can get very targeted. And so you might have a campaign that is after your organization and it's looking for specific users, it's looking for specific systems. So it can be. So, you have to be careful when you're dealing with these artifacts. You have a malicious Office document, you maybe think it was targeted against your CEO. Well, don't probably post that online because there could be proprietary or sensitive information about the employees and about the organization and about their internal assets. So, if you're firing off an investigation or you're dealing with third parties, make sure that they understand that, and they should, to keep those artifacts, sensitive and not disclosed. It's very common for folks in this field to there's a lot of online tools to take those and scan them on online tools, but now everybody else can get access to those. So we have to be careful there. Let's see here. I just got a few more things. Exploit kits. So this is one that I like to touch on because they were a big problem a few years ago. It's called the exploit kit. You may have heard of it as the drive-by download. This is what made, don't click that link. This is what made that popular, because if you clicked on that link and you went to a site that had an exploit kit there, then they could exploit your browser, run code, download malware. And all you had to do was go to the site. This was a bigger problem, mainly with Flash. If you remember Flash is kind of what made the internet tolerable for many years, but it was just awful technology, actually. It had lots of problems, lots of bugs. And so it was oftentimes abused, exploited in order to run arbitrary code. These are so damaging because all you had to do was go to the site that hosted an exploit kit and have a vulnerable browser. And then things would just happen automatic. You didn't have to open a doc. You didn't have to click a button and enable content. So this is where that whole don't click on bad links. We're talking about a phishing attack like we just were. The phishing site's not going to do anything. It's not going to exploit your browser. It's just there to try to get your credentials. But with exploit kits, that was bad news stuff. The good news is Flash is dead. If you're still using Flash, you need to run hard, run fast, run far. You should not be on Flash. Most browsers don't even support it anymore. And most browsers are fairly secure. Definitely exploit kits are still out there, and they do abuse vulnerabilities found in browsers to do the exact same of capability that I just talked about, but they're far less prevalent. A few years ago, you could find them everywhere. Now it's pretty rare when we come across one. So using a modern browser, using one that's kept up to date, that's going to go a long way in protecting you from this sort of attack. That's not to say, here's an example. This is actually from a Mac. I was carelessly searching because I'm on a Mac and malware doesn't affect me. But I was searching for something and clicked on a link, went to the site. It popped up this dialog to say, hey, the latest version is ready to install. Well, duh, I don't run Flash, but if we were to do this is their way of saying, I can't exploit your browser because I don't know how to, but if you download this thing and run it for us, then we'll get malware on your system. So this can be another way in which users are attacked. Again, they don't have a way to exploit the browser and automate this process. So kind of like the Office document, they're relying on you and the user to do some interaction. Here's another example. another Flash player thing down in the bottom. Looks very legitimate, looks very real. You click accept, it'll tell you to download, requires some user interaction, but it's malware. Well, I think I'm out of time.
I think I was just going to say, Josh, I think we're just at the last spot. If anyone has any questions, please send them in right now. I haven't received anything yet so far. I'll give that just a second. First and foremost, while we just wait for that, thank you so much, Josh, for presenting. This was amazing, great content. It's one that I always come away absolutely terrified after going through everything. But it's great to know that there's so much resources out there that are available for people to go through. In case anything else comes in, I guess my one question, is there anything, just big picture advice wise that you'd have for everyone? Got one in here from Ashley. Do you have a managed security provider? Any recommendations?
No, I don't have a recommendation for MSP or MSSP. I don't work with any personally, so it's hard for me to say. I think SDN provides a service like that. I can't even provide good insight right now off the top of my head as to how to evaluate one. If I was working with you, I know the things I would ask, but it would be hard to summarize that in a few seconds. So I just can't point to anybody here, regionally or nationally, for that matter.
Good advice, I think, Ashley, for that is just always to go through.
Eric, you keep cutting out.
I was just going to comment, I believe some of your former students own Infotech in Madison. Is that correct?
I don't know who owns it. It is in Madison, though.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if there are a number of students there. I mean, reputation goes a long way, but again, does it have a good reputation because they do IT right? That doesn't mean that they necessarily do the security portion of it right. And even students, as much as we try, even students coming out of a program that is focused on security, there's still a lot to learn. And a lot of times I hear them talking, kind of out of college, and there's still a lot of misunderstandings until they've gotten some experience, they've gotten some years under their belt, and maybe, and unfortunately, dealt with an incident or two. I mean, a lot of them are really sharp, really talented, really smart. They do a great job. They go intern places like the NSA, but still, they're young. And cybersecurity, again, like any profession, it's not just something you learn in 4 years. It's a lot. It covers a lot. I mean, we talked about servers and applications and monitoring, and there's just any number of things that you could take that one topic and become that could be your career right there, let alone all of it.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for the invitation, Eric. Hope everyone got something from the presentation. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And I'm happy to discuss this, as you can tell, at length. So thank you again.
Thank you.